Welcome to the Restive Perspective, a show about Restive Ventures and our views on the market. And today we're expanding our show for the first time. So it's not just going to be me in interview format. We have Ryan, who's my partner at Restive, on the video as well. So Ryan, you want to quickly introduce yourself, and then we're going to be talking about an interview that we did at a Go Restive event earlier. So maybe Ryan, tell us about both yourself and the event that we had.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on here, Cameron. Longtime listener, longtime fan from the sidelines. So I'm glad to finally step through and be on the show with you. Um, as you said, I am your partner here, or one of your partners here at Restive Ventures. And I've been doing this, since we started back in 2018. I started the business with Tyler. And as I think the audience knows, we're obviously early stage fintech investors. We're always trying to meet founders at the earliest stages and be really helpful and really supportive in their journey. Um, and one of the things that we saw, really late last year or throughout all of last year was just like there's a huge amount of opportunity at the earliest stages for founders to start, technology companies in financial services. There was this real generational change in the use of AI and other technology platforms that I think is making it much easier to bring products to market and really quickly, easier than ever to iterate. We're seeing a lot more infrastructure in place to help companies grow and scale. So a lot of the things we spent months working on years ago, how to think about a bank partner, how to think about getting live with payments, that is all, a lot of that's been kind of abstracted away now. It's much easier to get live with that. And then, the regulatory environment also has shifted quite a bit. Not sure it's gotten clearer, but it's gotten probably less onerous for the near term for many startups. And so, at the end of last year, we said, this is such a great time to start a startup. We really should be encouraging more founders to get out there and do that. And we had this idea of pulling together our network, our broader universe, and launching this one-day event called Go Restive to really help those founders at the earliest stages. Probably haven't yet raised capital for the most part. It might even be kind of earlier than we invest. Get live, get connected, kind of know who to know where the tools are, kind of learn from some of the best in the industry. And during a one-day event, just really kind of dramatically expand their network and hopefully accelerate what they're trying to do. And then from our perspective, obviously, I saw that as a great opportunity to meet new founders that we could potentially invest in. And so that's really where Go Restive came from, and I think it was a great success, and it's awesome to be able to bring some of those sessions to your listeners.
Yeah, I mean, I think the cool thing is it was kind of a teaser for the broader market around what we always do for portfolio companies. And we wanted to highlight a lot of the sessions that we knew that viewers really appreciated for those that couldn't even make it in person. So yeah, we're excited to bring it to the platform today. And really, this first one that we're highlighting is kind of the marquee speaker that we had, who's Ken Lin. So do you want to kind of tee up who Ken Lin is and some of the outline of the conversation?
Yes. So Ken Lin, for those who might not know, was the founder and CEO of Credit Karma, which is probably certainly one of the country's largest fintech companies. I think certainly one of the larger fintech exits of the last decade. He sold his company to Intuit a couple of years ago, multi-billion-dollar exit, and really became the centerpiece of Intuit's consumer-facing product suite. Ken started this business, over a decade ago now, and was one of the first companies to really think about empowering consumers with information, and in this case, their credit score, so they could make better decisions, and really just built this into a business that I think no one at the time thought it could be as big as it was, and it really kind of captured this giant wave of the digitization of financial services, of this kind of empowering consumers to get more control over their data and their financial decisions, and I think really improving the financial outcomes for millions of Americans. And so this was an incredibly influential business and great commercial and financial success, and is still an incredibly important company in our economy. And so Ken had actually just rolled off of his time at Intuit earlier this year, and we had this really unique opportunity to kind of bring his story public for one of the first times. I think this might have been the first time he really talked about what that experience was like. And so it was really interesting just to hear about his journey and how he got there. And he's also just such a kind and generous person, and so thoughtful that it's really hard not to hear this and just not be happy that someone got to be so successful by just being a really good guy.
Well, what we wanted to do for listeners, I mean, I definitely, as a viewer in the audience, thought there were a lot of interesting threads. So, what we're going to do here is, have a little bit of conversation around some of our takeaways before rolling over to the interview. But I one of the big things for me was he was just a genuinely nice guy. Like you hear this you hear, all these stories about X and Y and Z founder, and you had to be an asshole to be successful. And he really pulled forward one, how important authenticity was, but two, he was like, listen, there were times when I was probably nicer than I should have been. But I think if I hadn't shown that side of me, I wouldn't have been as successful. And so for me, like the one of the bigger takeaways was just like, you don't have to either compromise your personality or be an asshole to get ahead in business, which was kind of a cool example. Yeah, I don't know, anything else jump out to you, especially on that Ken as a person?
No, I mean, I think that, that's funny because I'm like trying, as you're talking, I'm trying to think if there are people that I know that have been really successful who are jerks in this space. And like, not really. I mean, it is weirdly strange. Like, I've always had this analogy of like, kind of ventures, like you're in like an old bank where they had like the pneumatic tubes that would like shoot the tube up and it would go up. And you have these companies and these people you meet that have these businesses, and then with like you bump into them a couple years later, and their business were like billions of dollars, and it's like the pneumatic tube took like the person just went whoop, and, like shot them up, and like they like did this incredible, and had this incredible outcome where these things worked out, and you're like, oh, that was a nice guy. Like, I can't believe that happened to that guy. Like, it just feels like that really the market really does over time reward people who are like good people. And you know, I was, as I was interviewing him, so you're both kind of listening, obviously to what he's saying, but trying to think of what to kind of say next. But one of the parts that kind of sticks with me is he's talking about Mickey Malka of Ribbit Capital's kind of first investment in the company, and this was back in when it was Ribbit Fund One, so one of the first investments that Mickey had made. And it talks about Mickey's hustle to land this investment, and the and this and he talks about how Mickey would organize these dinners and would have all these people, and it was all these operators who were there who knew a lot about um, what what he was interested in. And Mickey, I think, Ken turned to Mickey and said, hey, "That was a really great dinner." And Mickey's like, "Well, this whole thing was for you." Like, he was organizing these events just for Ken, because so that he could like get into this deal and do it. And it just goes to show that like being able to provide value, being really useful to somebody, just really pays off in the end. And like Mickey's obviously gone on to great success as well. And so it's just interesting that it's kind of on all sides, that that authenticity and that desire to actually do something really positive is important.
Yeah. That Ribbit story kind of sparked another thing from the interview, because there was this almost sliding doors moment where he bootstrapped the company. He had some friends and family money come in, and then he was going out to raise a Series A, but it was in like '08, which was the worst time to fundraise, especially in financial services. And he got one term sheet that he walked away from because it was overly punitive. And subsequently, he raised money from QED and then Ribbit, but it just showed this moment of absolute conviction. Like, in one scenario, he's at the end of his rope. He absolutely needs capital. He's taking the only thing he can get, but he walked away from that. And one, I think that was really powerful to show, you actually have more leverage and more agency than you might think as a founder. And two, like, I don't think it would have set him up well to get, this caliber of downstream investor and actually have the sort of outcome he would have, because it was pretty punitive on the ownership side.
Yeah, or the discipline. I mean, think of all the other pieces of discipline that would come from that, right? Like, you make that decision day one to not take this term sheet, and then it's redeemed. I mean, you learn that was the right decision. You have years to realize that was the right decision, and so you can think of all the other decisions you would make as a founder. We see this in our own portfolio, where you have this conviction to kind of stand up for what you think, or where you're going to kind of charge forward. There's so many things that happen in starting one of these businesses that having had that experience would just give you just so much more conviction in all of your decisions. And so you can imagine when he goes to negotiate a sale, he's in a totally different kind of mindset than if it had been easy the entire time.
Totally. But it is so hard because I also know talking to other, like we're so close to a lot of the founders that we work with. And I know I've gotten some phone calls and they're like, I'm weighing this versus this. And it's not a clear answer, right? But oftentimes it does go back to needing those really strong principles and like feeling like you have that foundation to give you the framework to walk away. Because in another world, it's so easy just to say, yes, this contract's in front of me, or yes, I got this offer, or something else as well. And I think without having that framework of that conviction, it can get a little loosey and easier to do the bad deal.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's a fine line though, too. 'Cause at the same time, it worked out. Like, we have some survivorship bias. Like, it worked out for him because he did this. I mean, and it is hard to think if you're a founder and you're facing one of those things, like that's a really difficult decision because, it's not like that it's going to work out in the end. And I think that's what's really hard about it.
Well, the last thing that jumped out to me about this interview was Ken used this term that was like, I discovered a secret. And it was early on in his business, and he had discovered that TV advertising worked really well in a very hacky way. And he had gotten, a lot of feedback from experts saying you needed to put in millions of dollars for TV to be successful, and then it was questionable at best. And they kind of hacked their way into this ad that just started working.
Yeah.
And he was flying under the radar, and they were compounding, right?
Yeah.
So I love that idea of how to discover and exploit a secret.
And it's like, it's a great story too. I mean, as you'll hear in the session, because like they just had like no idea. They spent like $50, and all of a sudden they're just getting like just random signups in the middle of the night when this works. But I will say, I mean, you see this in their company. You see this in almost every company that's successful. Like, they start out like doing, I mean, a lot of things they're doing early on just like seem like, for lack of a better word, kind of dumb. Like, you're like constantly we had another session at someone constantly posting on LinkedIn about like, issues in their industry. And at first you're getting like one like, and, it just takes a while for it to compound. Before long, you're like a thought leader in some various issue. Or there's plenty of startups like, I remember, Albert was an early investor in Albert, which is another consumer fintech business, and Donald did really well. But in their early advertising days, they were literally drawing sketches on paper that they would like scan in and like post on Instagram, because it was so different. It got like really good engagement. It would drive users. And so you really never know. And I think the best teams are always just finding those kind of unconventional little hacks and always reinventing what they're doing. And it builds this muscle within the company of like taking chances and trying to push the envelope and trying to find new ways to drive engagement and to kind of continuously reinvent the brand, which really does compound over time.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is it's kind of questioning conventional wisdom. So, if that was the rule of thumb, it's like to get TV to work, it had to be this big budget thing. And I think like, especially as we look at AI and everything that's changing here, like you can't necessarily look towards the past and say that's what's going to work in the future. So I think it's a really good, even though it was 20 years ago at this point.
It wasn't that. I don't think it was that long ago. It wasn't 20 years ago. It was like,
call it 15.
It was a different media market, but I don't
totally
know.
Different media market. but I do think like even founders today can kind of take that lesson and not just take what the general zeitgeist is as a rule of thumb. Well, with that, why don't we roll over to the interview?
Thank you all for sticking around for the day. Really appreciate it. Really excited with this last session to close out with Ken Lin. Ken, I think, is probably one of the earliest founders in what is now fintech. When he raised money for Credit Karma, I don't think there was really any sense of this even being an industry. There certainly wasn't anyone calling it fintech. His first investors were funds, we'll get into it, were funds that we all know now as being kind of some of the iconic early stage or fintech funds in the world, were just getting started. It was a company that was born out of financial crisis. And it was a business that was solving a problem that the founder saw, but really the market was like, this is not a thing at all. I think it was in many ways. I obviously wasn't raising money in 2010 myself, but it sounds like it was probably a lot worse than it was even in the depths of last year or 2022. And obviously he turned this business into one of the iconic, if not the best outcome in fintech of the last, I think, decade, 2 decades. It's had a profound impact on how consumers use financial services. It's had a profound impact on how incumbents think about connecting with customers. It's in many ways changed the nature of how people interact with the internet and how they feel comfortable putting their financial services, their financial information in it. And it was led by a guy who's really, really nice. He's very kind. He's generous at this time, like the fact that he agreed even to come do this. And I think we're really lucky to be here because he's completely unencumbered by any other obligation. He left Intuit about a month ago. And I think, is this your first speaking?
Yeah, I'm not even sure how to speak into a mic anymore. So.
This is perfect. So thank you for joining us. So I want to start from the beginning, like just what were you doing before Credit Karma?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me here, and thanks for sticking around and listening to the story. So context before Credit Karma is I've always been a little bit of a serial entrepreneur. So back in, let's see, 2006, 2007, I had started a little bit of a marketing agency, and we were managing, I don't know, something like $40 million in digital spend for companies like Wells Fargo, Liberty Mutual, actually a company called Prosper, which we could talk a little bit about the OGs of fintech. They were one of the first peer-to-peer lenders in the space. And I realized that business was hard. See, I don't know how to use this. I realized that business was a little bit hard because, as an agency, you tended to, get the CMO takes all the credit. If the program does well, you get all the blame. If it doesn't go well. And I realized it just wasn't scalable and wasn't the business I was very interested in. And I think sort of apropos to this audience, I really spent about 2 years trying to figure out what is the thing that I want to do next. And as luck would have it, I was scammed into one of these sites that sort of claimed you get your free credit score, but the reality was you couldn't. And this is a long time ago, so I'll sort of describe it. But in 2006, 2007, credit scores were a big deal in the sense that most consumers know they existed, but they're actually very hard to access. And there would be commercials on television that said, hey, get your free credit score. But the reality is you'd have to put in your credit card number. And if you didn't cancel the subscription that you enrolled in, they would start charging you effectively $20 a month. And lo and behold, most people didn't realize this until they were charged $200, $300, and then they would cancel. So we had a very simple idea with Credit Karma, which was, one, all of the banks that I was working with needed to credit target a consumer, right? So Prosper, for example, they were looking for customers. If the credit score was too high, they didn't really need Prosper. If the credit score was too low, Prosper couldn't underwrite them. And there was this sort of sweet spot that Prosper was looking for. So we said, well, if we just gave away the credit score for free and consumers are looking for it, can we create a business model that is focused on advertising and matching consumers with financial services company? So it's a very simple idea. It didn't necessarily have a ton of traction, but it was the best idea that I had back in 2007. And off we went. So for a year, we were in stealth. Stealth meant no one cared what we did, but we were building the product. And about a year after sort of all of that work, we launched our beta. And lo and behold, in the first couple of months, we had maybe like 150,000 users on the platform. So pretty powerful, and felt like we were really onto something.
And so tell us, at that point, it's launched, you got a beta. It sounds like we caught up briefly, you kind of self-capitalized this early on, kind of a friends and family round. What was that first fundraising round like? Where was the company at as far as metrics, size? Give us a sense of the timing.
Yeah, so for me, in 2006, 2007, when we had the idea, I basically wrote a check for every dollar I had, right? So that's something like $200,000 maybe. And then I raised another $300,000 from effectively friends and family. And the good news is because of the marketing agency I'd run, I knew how to be cash efficient. And we were running the business for, effectively a year and a half on just that $500,000. There were about 3 or 4 of us. I remember I didn't really take a salary in those early days. But we were to a point in 2008, 2009, where we felt like, wow, we were really set up well for a Series A. But if you remember 2008, 2009, that was not a great time period to fundraise, and it particularly wasn't a good time to fundraise if your business was in financial services, right? So it was the Great Recession. So at that point, we had probably had metrics of something like $1 million run rate, probably losing $300,000, maybe $400,000 a year, pretty modest. But we were also running out of money. And what we thought was going to be a simple fundraise in the sense that we got a lot of metrics, we have traction, we have product market fit, people will write us a check. That did not happen because in the backdrop, Lehman was going out of business, Bear Stearns was going out of business, and it wasn't even clear if the banks were going to be solvent. I mean, I remember Advanta was a credit card company that literally was the only customer that stuck with us through sort of the collapse and unwinding. And if you know the history, they went bankrupt like 3 months later.
So all your customers are like failing.
All of our customers are failing. I probably took 100 no's in terms of pitching up and down Sandhill. Again, fintech wasn't a term. So it was a pretty dire time. I think we realized that no one was going to write us a check. So I went back to my network and all of my friends and family. I was completely tapped out at that point. And I said, hey, we probably need $300,000 to get us through another, year, if I'm being optimistic. And luckily, we cobbled that together. That gave us a lifeline. And in that time period, I continued to knock on doors and continue to try to fundraise. And I mean, I oftentimes think these are the stories of entrepreneurship that don't get told, right? You think everything goes up and to the right. You think you're in some blog, and at least back in my day, it was TechCrunch. Maybe there's some new blog today, but you have always heard the success stories, right? You got this biasness, but the reality is, I think as a founder, as a CEO, the job is you got to keep your team in the game, and I felt that was my number one priority, was to sort of keep our team in the game. And other things solve themselves, but you got to keep the team in the game.
So what was the terms of those first rounds? You remember what those prices those were?
I don't remember what those first rounds were, but I'll tell you one sort of war story I remember, and this was a really tough one. I remember that we were trying to raise, roughly $1 million for the Series A, and this is sort of in the depths of that time.
Wait, trying to raise $1 million of capital.
$1 million of capital, and we had gotten that last 350 from friends and family, and they had come in at $10 million, right? How I made that number up, I literally plucked it out of the air and was like, oh, trust me, right? It'll work out. And I remember that I was trying to raise $1 million. Everyone said no to us, and we got one term sheet. And that one term sheet said, well, we can't get you to $10 million. We think the valuation is, more like $4 million. And we think you need at least $2.5 million if you're going to make it to sort of the other side of the chasm. And I remember I got my 2 co-founders, Ryan and Nicole, and I remember having a meeting with them very distinctly. I said, I think this is a crap term sheet. I can't imagine us selling 60% of our equity. Can't imagine the fact that we took $350,000 from our friends and family at a $10 million valuation. And now we're going to give them a down round. I think there's something very motivating about taking money from your friends and family, right? Because you have to deliver that money back. So I remember having a very hard, heart-to-heart with both of them and said, I don't have another option. I think we can be very proud of what we did, but I just don't think this is the right option for us. And as a team, we decided that we would walk away from it. And the good news is, I think maybe a month and a half later, I flew out. You talked about some of the iconic leaders in fintech. I flew out to Washington, D.C. Out of a serendipitous introduction to QED Capital. QED is Nigel Morris, Frank Rotman. They came out of Capital One, so the credit card industry. They really understood what we were trying to do. And I remember I took a red eye out on Tuesday, met with them, 10, 11 o'clock in DC, got on the 4 o'clock flight back to the Bay Area. And by the time I landed in the Bay Area, they had already sent over a term sheet, right? So after 100 no's and just feeling like there was nothing there, and to the idea of keeping the team in the game, when someone really understood what we were trying to do, they really got into this day. I mean, I love a lot of VCs. I dislike some, just not because they said no, but more, they sort of tell you how great you are, but they don't tell you why they did invest, right? And I always found that to be super unhelpful and very not front-end up candid. But operators, and I think a lot of times is a lot better than the operators, right? Your idea is something that they're not working from. A lot of times, no offense, right, to any VCs, there's a lot of pattern matching. But a lot of times it's your passion, your expertise, your conviction that really carries the idea through. And I think this is, one of those that no one really understood it. And when they did, it worked really well. And, subsequently there was, plenty of fundraising after that, but they were all easy.
And then the other one I thought was, so this was, and you said this was out of QED's first fund.
Yeah, I think we were like the third or fourth investment.
So props to the emerging managers out there going early. And then what was the other, you mentioned another fund that was like you got the second check out of.
Yeah, so our second check was our Series B, and that was Ribbit Capital. So Mickey has become a dear friend of mine, but Mickey was a hustler. I mean, I remember this great story he told me. So we had met some random introduction. Someone introduced me to Mickey, and we started talking. We weren't even fundraising at the time, but I love this story. He's Mickey's very charismatic. But he really figured out what I was very interested in, which was I really cared about operators. I really cared about investors who were operators. And I remember the way he tells the story to me now is that back in 2011, 2012, right when they were getting started, he actually threw on two cool events. Like he had two great dinners where they were talking about brand. They were, they had Dan Ariely, which is particularly irrational about behavioral economics, and they had the CMO of Visa. This is two separate events. I remember at both of these events, I was sitting at the right hand of Mickey, and we're watching all these presentations and having a great dinner and just learning a bunch. And there's like 20 or 30 people. The way he tells the story, I was like, dude, that was all set up for you, Ken. Like I wanted you to go and take the money, and that's sort of the hustle that's required, right? In both sort of the fundraising and also I think the investing side of it to understand. And there's something that you have a lot of belief and conviction in. Those are the stories that everyone goes through.
So then flipping it to the company, and when you were building it, was there a moment where you thought it turned a corner, where you're like, this is big?
There's a few. I'll tell you a fun one that was really profound for us. It sort of talks a little bit about the unconventional. So we were running the business for about 4 or 5 years. And we'd gotten the business to basically unit economics, meaning that for the data that we bought and the revenue that we were creating, we're effectively break even, right? We spend $1, we make like $1.05, $1.10. So we're at this point where like, okay, it's kind of working. Our margins will improve, we'll drive down costs, but we need to really figure out a way to scale this business. So, we've got about $1 million in the bank. And I remember talking to, I used to work with this company called Hill Holiday. They're a marketing agency back in Boston. And I talked to him and I said, hey, got $1 million in the bank. I think we've gotten to unit economics. We really want to scale. And I kind of want to test television because we've been doing search, we've been doing display, we've been doing sort of all the digital pieces that, we all know and love today. And they said to me, well, Ken, to do television right, you're going to have to spend about, $100,000, $200,000 on the commercial. You're going to have to spend about $500,000 in media, and that's like a very low probability you might get a read as to whether or not television is going to work for you, right? So we're like, well, I have $1 million in the bank. I don't think I can spend $700,000 to do this test. So we said, well, what if we try to do this a little bit more guerrilla, right? So I remember we took my DSLR and we shot a commercial. We rented a sound studio. We bought some props. We literally had employees as hand actors. The commercial is called Calendar. I think it's on YouTube somewhere. We produced that commercial for roughly $300 all in. So the story gets even better, right? So I forget that we completely that we shot this commercial. So back in the day, we said they're called good hour emails, right? So you would get an email 5 minutes after the hour if the prior hour had a record number of registrations. So it was the day after Christmas, and I got one at 11:05. I'm actually walking in a parking lot in Las Vegas, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, that's kind of cool. Didn't think anything of it, because every once in a while we'd get on a local news station about Credit Karma, protecting your credit and something like that. So I'm like, oh, cool, no big deal. So then the next day at 11:05, I get the same email again. I'm like, well, that's really weird. Normally, news stations, they don't play stories over and over again. So I remember calling Greg, who was our head of marketing at the time, said, what's up with these good hour emails? And he's like, Ken, I think it was television. And we had like maybe 100 extra registrations per hour than we normally did. And so the litmus question is like, well, how much did we spend for those, those 100 users? And he's like, $50, right? So I'm like, so we acquired like a user for 50 cents on television. So play this out a year. We figured out buying remnant inventory on Google television auction at the time, and basically all remnant inventory, which is basically cheap overnight stuff. You heard Anish talk about this a little bit earlier, was really our aha moment. That year, we went from $0 marketing dollars on television to something like $125 million.
Wow.
Over the course of 12 months. Because we figured out like it worked like gangbusters. And I remember we had these screens that would monitor concurrent sessions. I mean, like, I remember there would be days in August where every day was a new record, because we were just pumping as much money into television auction, remnant inventory as we could. And no one knew our secret back then, right? Like, we were flying under the radar. People were like, television doesn't work for digital media. And there were all these preconceived notions. So that was a moment we felt like we really figured out
what
something.
did the revenue do? If you went from 0 with $1 million in the bank and you spent 125 million, is that just all earnings?
It wasn't all earnings. We had roughly like a 45-day payback on acquisitions.
But that was
so you can compound it, right? So if you spent $5 million, like in 2 months, that $5 million would turn into $10 million, right? And then you could put that right back in television. I mean, this is a cool story. I mean, we over the course of the Credit Karma history raised something like $1 billion, $1 billion, $2. If I look at our cumulative losses, we never were more than $5 million negative, right? So just say that another way, and it's not a brag, it's more like you can be super efficient, right? We always thought about we got to pay the bills. Yeah. Because I'm a little bit of a, I have history in that I had seen the dot-com bubble in 1999 and sort of the exuberance and the crazy spending. And as a lesson to myself, I said we'd never really go on that, really fancy offices, fancy chairs, and all those things. But that's how we were able to do that.
Do you think that early experience where you were so close to the trees was just grinded in you, that you just never get that? You just like embedded that efficiency into how you operated?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell this story, like, I can put together an IKEA desk and chair faster than anybody in this room, like, I promise you, because that was just the way that we operated. Yeah. We were so lean, and we always thought about not spending those extra dollars. We have lavish, extravagant parties near the end, but later on, not near the end, but we're not done. But I think that mentality is really. It can be really helpful. I mean, I think sometimes, too much money is a bad thing sometimes, because it gives you a sense of security. There are a lot of things to figure out in the early days, right? I mean, unit economics, product market fit, getting the right team together. Like, those are the things that money can't solve. Those are things that are roll up your sleeves, get to work, and get a little bit better each and every day. And I think those are sometimes the things that people don't talk about. I get a lot of inflection point questions, but I actually think the through line, you only get to those inflection points if you get a little bit better each and every day. And that's what I sort of preach.
What do you, to continue that kind of drain on the fact, the efficiency question, how did you create that culture internally? I mean, and also, maybe even more broadly, like, how did you set yourself up as a leader to lead that culture internally? Because you're adding more people, obviously you're evolving. How did you keep everyone focused on being so efficient, especially as you're growing?
I mean, I think there's two aspects of that, right? I mean, I think one is the operating model around metrics. I mean, one of the good fortunes that I had is I came from an analytic background. So I worked for a credit card company. And in that world, metrics were the world. And I brought that forward to the way that I operated Credit Karma. So I knew, I still have, the prior to my last days at Credit Karma, I mean, people would still send me, sort of a reimagined cohort workbook that I had created 16 years ago, right? It was newer, it's faster, nicer. But it really talked about how are all of our various cohorts from every month of registration from 2011, cheat a little bit because I think we lost a lot of data in the migration or sort of cut over. But like I could see how they're performing by credit score, by device. And us knowing those trends and being able to pinpoint when there are problems in the business, or you know what, it was that product release that sort of blew up every cohort. Or it was like, wow, when we actually registered a cohort in 2023, they actually performed 26% better than every cohort before them. This cohort is going to be fantastic when we think 3 years out from now. That was one model that was really important. So understanding the metrics, understanding what really mattered to the business long term. I think that's one component. And then the other one, I think people have different leadership styles. I think the leadership style that really worked and helped us foster is I tend to be a very trusting person. I'm not a micromanager. So it was really hiring good people and letting them work, right? It's communications, it's teamwork. But that was the through line of the people side of it is we hired, I heard a little bit of the conversations about, heads of sales that didn't work out. And I think all of those things can be true. But I think they have to be part of your skill or your culture. Maybe let's just take this in a slightly different direction, which is, your culture as a founder, CEO, leader of your company is really your personality, is what I've kind of described, right? Or discovered. If you're a controlling micromanager, and that's not a bad thing, like it's going to be very tops down. And that's the type of infrastructure, the team that you should build. You can't write it on a piece of paper and then hope the culture turns in that way, right? You have to have a reflection and look in the mirror like, this is how I want to operate the business. This is me. Or it could be you're not the right person to lead the culture in the company. But my reflection over those years was that those two are highly correlated. So you should spend some time thinking about your personality traits, the culture of the company that you want to have, and whether there's alignment in that. And if not, you should spend some time against it because I think it really does matter.
I want to skip ahead a little bit to the acquisition. How did that come about? And I guess where were you taking the business? I mean, the business had had enough scale at that point that probably could have gone public. You certainly probably could have raised more money. Why exit? And kind of what were the options?
Yeah, so another one of these serendipity moments. So context was, so I think we're probably now in 2000, testing my memory here, 2016, 2017. So, one of my friends, a banker, said, hey, it'd be great if you just go and had a little conversation with the guys at Intuit. Sure, always happy to take a meeting. Took a meeting, they asked a bunch of questions. There's always the dance and euphemisms of like what's going on in these particular meetings. I didn't really care. We were pretty happy with the way that the business was going. So there's a little context. Again, I'm going to have this precisely wrong, but I think we're probably $700 million in revenue, profitable to the tune of 25% margins, growing 20-30%. So like a really good standalone business. And the reason why we didn't go public was I never really thought about going public as the end game. I just thought about the mission and what we were trying to achieve in terms of driving change in the space, building something that was consumer focused and making consumers' lives better. That was my primary focus. So I said, well, we don't need the money, then why would you go public? That's just a financing event. So that was the background. Intuit spent a lot of time, and I think they came back to us in 2018 and said, here's the offer, and we'd love to buy you guys. And I said, no, thanks. And they're like, wait, no, no rebuttal, no counter offer, nothing, just a no thanks. And I'm like, yeah, it's not even close to what I think is what we are worth. And quite honestly, like, I'm not looking to sell the business. So they kind of said, okay, and went away. And another year later goes by, and Sasan, who's the CEO, calls me back and says, well, how about this number, right? And then I'm like, well, now you're kind of where at least I was. And the long and short of it is we talked quite a bit back and forth. So the dollars got there, but maybe more importantly, like the why, and why did I do that? So in 2015, we actually bought a tax company. And the reason why we bought a tax company was we had effectively, I'd say about 60, 70% of a consumer's financial profile with the credit report, all the debt that they owed. But we were actually missing their income and their assets, right? That would be, great, you owe $100,000, but what's your income? Do you have other assets? Do you have a home and so on? And we thought, well, buying a tax company would actually complete that puzzle for us, right? Going back to this idea, if you really understand your customer, you could really help them in a profound way. So we did that, and the conversations, and Intuit's counter to that was they started a business called Turbo, which was like a credit score company, right? So we're competitive in that space, but what hit me was it was really hard to get traction in tax. We got to like 3 million, 4 million tax filers, but we had a base of 80, 90 million members, right? So it was hard to convert those people into tax users. And we thought, well, if we have the combination of our 100 million members and TurboTax's 40 million plus members, tax filers each and every year, we would actually get to scale and be able to move faster. And that idea made sense to me. And that was really the premise for the deal. And again, for me, it wasn't about selling or IPO. It was just about, can you actually change the trajectory of consumers? Can you make a better financial landscape and set of opportunities?
So, I mean, you've had this incredible journey. You sold it to Intuit. You spent 4 years?
4 years, yep, after the close.
What's it like now? Like
now?
Yeah, you're not working. Like, you built this thing. It still exists. You've presumably made far more money than you necessarily know what to do with. Like, what are you doing?
Well, I mean, I think on one hand, it's probably, my kids are still young, right? They're 9 and 11. I mean, I imagine it's, like watching your kids leave the nest, right? They're adults and, they're off doing their own things. And you look at some things and you're like, why the hell did you do that? And then there's probably other things that they do, like super proud. And I probably have a little bit of a sentiment of that. In terms of me personally, I'm traveling a bunch. Like I was literally in Patagonia last week, and Saudi Arabia and Fiji and all these other places. But for me, I think it's been 17 years. So I really wanted just to catch up on all the things that were important to me, and a lot of that is just family and spending quality time with people I care about.
Do you think that you're the same person at the core as when you started this now?
I think a lot of my values and principles are the same. I mean, I think a lot's been changed, right? I mean, over the course of 17 years, you change. I like to think I'm a better leader. I like to think I'm a better communicator. But what I'm probably most proud of is the fact that, like, the virtues and the principles that we started Credit Karma with, I can say at least I walked out the door with those principles still in hand and still firmly grounded within Credit Karma. I'm sure Credit Karma will change over the course of the next 5 years or so, but being able to live that, and one of the through lines that I remember sharing, and it always has lived with me, was that there have been at least 6 or 7 near extinction events at Credit Karma, and I remember that very first one being that I didn't tell this story, but the long story is, like, the bureau stopped wanting to work with us like 30 days in when they figured out what we were doing. And I remember just saying, you know what, even if that happens, like, we should be proud of the fact we built this platform. We, at that point, gave away a free, 100,000 free credit scores. And if all that goes away, like, let's not live in a world of regret of, we could have sold the data, we could have done, we could have done all these terrible things. We didn't do those things. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we all change over time, but the thing that is most important to me, and I would maybe implore all of you to think about is, staying with those values and the things that you start off with. Because over time, people throw money at you. There's always some incentive to do something that you might not have done when you were at the business day one and a naive entrepreneur that you feel like you might want to do because, maybe it's easy, maybe because it's a lot of money, maybe it's because whatever. But those are the regret moments that I think a lot about, and I always try to, reflect on those and sort of teach a lot of, at least my leaders, my team, why those are important things in terms of the way that we operate.